I'm going to speak for a moment on what Daniel Elazar called the reinforcing mechanisms of federalism. I think it's a really important component of understanding the role that federalism plays, American federalism, in the process of government. And I think the issue, using the issue on elections and the Electoral College in particular, is a pretty good example. And it will give you an idea of how on one issue, the role of the states is more than simply an administrative processing or a geographic boundary to subdivide power. I'm going to try something a little different in this video. I'm going to be using some PowerPoints that I've put together from some other material I've written, which kind of tells you the story in writing as we go along, so you sort of have a script. I'll make that available as part of the attachments, and we'll post them in the class as well. But I thought for this particular discussion, it might be a little easier if you had at least an annotated outline narrative to go along with it. So as I talk, I'll be posting a PowerPoint slide that has some text that reinforces what I'm saying, and with the post you can refer to it afterwards. Let me talk just about elections in the United States and the critical role of states and why the states are so important. It's pretty clear if you just observe the primary process that we go through every 4 years, that the states are the mechanism by which we elect our president and all of our office holders. We could have national elections, a national primary to pick the nominee of the Democratic Party, nominee of the Republican Party, and have them square off. Other countries have a series of elections. We could do many things, but from the very beginning of the country, we decided that engaging the states as the entity that produces the candidates and produces the electors that result in the president is the best way of maintaining the very positive role of states in the Union. And as we said last week, the reason for the positive role in the states, maintaining it, is because the framers definitely believed that the best guarantee of freedom and the best guarantee to avoid a tyranny of the majority, or to have a situation in which on an issue of inflamed passion or bad economic times, a despot could seize power with one election and run away with the country, change the Constitution, and create a monarchy, was to see to it that the election must be controlled by a process that saw to it that all of the regions of the country had an official participation, and the deliberate decision of each of the states in the system was going to be the process by which the chief executive was elected. That's an important distinction. And if you doubt their wisdom, just reflect on what happened in Germany in the 1930s, where Adolf Hitler won an election. He won a national election that was not designed by regions or states or provinces. But he won the election, he won a plebiscite, and within 6 months he declared himself to be the Fuhrer and eliminated the Weimar government and eliminated any opposition and took control of the country. The framers, in their wisdom, anticipated that and put in place a process that virtually makes that impossible to happen here. And the Electoral College is the primary way of doing so. Now, we carry the concept of the Electoral College into our nominating processes, as you see. Before there was primaries, we had national conventions where every 4 years a national political convention was held, and delegates were selected from each of the states to go to a big city like Chicago, New York, Texas, Los Angeles, and hold a national convention. If you recall seeing any videos of those in the day, I happen to remember those days, you see a big convention hall with people sitting in areas with a big sign that said California here and New York here, the state of Florida was over here. And they would do the roll call to nominate the president, and California would get the microphone and say, California casts its 54 votes for the next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The framers understood the notion of popular sovereignty, that in some way, shape, or form, the people were the sovereign, and the government had to reflect the will of the sovereign. And this new position called the chief executive must, in fact, reflect the will of the people. And the will of the people in those days was considered equivalent with the will of the states that they represented. So in trying to devise a process, the framers were far less concerned with having a numerical majority, because the concept of majority rule just didn't mean that much. It had been in place, there was no standards of it. No one was going to criticize whether there was a majority or minority, because that just wasn't a discussion. It was, does the selection process reflect the will of the people, or is it the will of the monarch? And what they were most concerned with was dealing with a system of any national process for anything that would engage what they referred to as tyranny of the majority, We'll talk about that in next week's session. But tyranny of the majority, in which a temporary majority, a 51 or 2% of the people who were so inflamed by popular passions, by bad economic news, by an unpopular decision, by war, could seize control of the government apparatus and change the whole thing, could elect a despot or a demagogue who would instantly begin unraveling the hard-fought winds of the Constitution. And so their purpose was to secure a commitment that the people will be responsible for the outcome of the elections, but that was not necessarily going to be a popular vote. There'll be other processes consistent with popular sovereignty that reveals the intent of the people. And they determined that using the states as the mechanism to select a president was the best guarantee that the people would be involved. The people would be driving it because presumably the states were reflecting the will of their people. And that was the intent. And it's a very important notion because people compare our process with direct democracy and majoritarian elections. And it was never set up that way and it wasn't intended that way. And the principles of federalism are what have kept the Electoral College surviving and thriving throughout the ensuing 200 years. Again, that sounds undemocratic, but that's not what the framers were. They were not trying to produce a numerical democracy. They were trying to produce a Republican form of government that would work and would reflect a consensus, and it would continue to engage the states in the process of government. And when Eleazar said the entire Constitution cannot be understood without recognizing the reinforcing mechanisms of federalism, that's what he was talking about. So let's talk a little bit about the Electoral College. It was the world's first system for electing a chief executive that involved the people, and it was based on the notion of popular sovereignty. As I said earlier, it did reflect the critical role of the states. Here's kind of how it worked. There basically was a two-tiered system for electing a president. First, the states would identify not their representatives and not their senators, but a different set of people that were contemporaneous with the issues around an election. Senators were elected 6 years ago, representatives were elected 2 years before that, but they felt it's important for electors to be selected at the time of the election. So separate from a senator and a congressman, states were asked to identify a slate of electors, people that the states in the legislatures, basically it was state legislatures, would say, well, come to Washington, and those people will meet on December 15th every year and cast a vote for the president. That's how the system was set up. So you had the people of the state of Connecticut electing their state legislatures, not their federal legislatures, presumably closer to the people. State legislators would pick a number of delegates to then come to Washington on December 15th. And determine the President of the United States. Now, before December 15th, there was a presidential election, which is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That election was intended to ratify the slate of electors, because the question was, how does a state get to pick who, in effect, was going to be the elector that goes cast a vote? Well, that was to be determined in the presidential election, where the people would vote in the state for a candidate, one candidate or another, and the winner of that state, that faction was able to select the electors that would go to Washington and vote for George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, etc. So it wasn't an arbitrary select some people and let them go to Washington and have their way. It was select people that corresponded with the way the state voted in the election. And that slate of electors, as opposed to a different slate of electors, Thomas Jefferson beat a fellow named Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson's electors got to go to Washington to vote for the president. And that system has more or less stayed in place ever since. And the number of electors was again tied to the Constitution and to popular sovereignty, because the number of electors was determined simply by taking the number of representatives that every state has, and that's driven by population, and the number of senators. So the number for any state, if a state has 60 electors, it's because it had 58 congressmen and 2 senators, and that gets you 50 electors. So the number of electors that each state had was also driven by population and by their congressional representation. So that was a two-tiered system in which they select the electors, and the electors then go to Washington to cast a vote. Now, over time, the process, although always indirectly based on population, did evolve. 24 states now require the elector to be chosen by the people in an election and require the result of that election to be cast in the vote December 15th. Not all states do, but the point is all states practice it. Some are required by law, some practice it. There's been virtually no instance in our history where an elector that goes to Washington or a bunch of electors changed the result that the people otherwise ordained. There's been a handful of elections where one or two or three called faithless electors decided to do a protest vote and vote for somebody else. But out of 540 votes, it's one or two or three, and it has never mattered in the final tally. So by and large, the system is still organized so that the people select the electors based on their choice during the presidential election, which candidate they preferred. Those electors go to Washington and they cast a vote. In reality, the vote is the exact same vote that the people demonstrate on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and the continuation of the Electoral College is just a formality, that vote on December 15th. That doesn't have to continue to happen, but it's been a tradition and a ceremony that once again reinforces the role of the states, because the roll is called by each state, and when each state delegation reads its vote, it's clear that the states have reported and we have a new president of the United States. Again, underscoring the role of the states in the system. Now, the only other caveat, which again underscored the role of the states, was the occurrence which has happened only a few times in our history, and it hasn't happened in many, many, many years, since the early 19th century, in which a majority vote does not happen in the Electoral College or the popular vote. The president can only be elected when a majority of the Electoral College votes are cast for one person. There are 540 currently votes in electoral votes in the United States government voting for president. That's a combination of all the congressmen and all the senators together. It's 470 congressmen and 100 senators. It's 540 votes. The winner must have at least half of that, 271. Must have half of the 540 to be declared a winner. If there is not more than half of the votes voting for a single person, then the Constitution says that election goes into the House of Representatives, where the House of Representatives will select the president. And the House of Representatives will proceed in that process in which each state gets one vote. And the roll will be called if there's a 3 or 4 way tie that causes an election to go to the House of Representatives. The roll will be called by state delegation, and Alabama and Arkansas and Alaska each get one vote for either candidate X or candidate Y. And at the end of the roll call, if a candidate does not have 50% of the vote, they do it again. And they do it again, as they do in most pieces of legislation, until a candidate emerges with a minority. Once again, this is underscoring the critical role of the states, and this is so important because the framers understood that unless the states as institutions have a direct say in both the running of the government and the makeup of the government, it will be much more easy for states to disengage or to find ways of opposing. But getting the majority of the states in the Union critically involved in the selection process was a key component of all of our election systems, but most specifically, the way we elect a president. Now, that's the good news. That's the story. That's the intention. It hasn't always worked that way, and hence the crisis, or what some call the crisis, in the Electoral College. Because there have been 4 times in our history, including the election of 2000, in which the person who has won the majority of the popular vote has not won the presidency. And to Democratic purists, that's considered among the highest insults and assaults. How can a person who lost the popular vote actually become the president? If you want to hear the full passion on that, just talk to Al Gore or anybody who was on Al Gore's staff when he actually won the majority of the vote by a small majority in the 2000 election, only to have a lot of processes take place because it was so close in Florida with the Supreme Court. It never went to the House of Representatives, but the process of government wound up finding George Bush was the winner. In fact, the process of government showed that George Bush won more electoral votes than Al Gore, even though he won less popular votes, and he became president. And that's considered a crisis. And I'll show you it can be a crisis. It is, as in any system, the nightmare scenario in which an election in which there are high stakes causes the person who actually lost the popular vote sometime by a significant majority, can wind up being president, and that is a problem. There's no doubt about it. The issue for students of democracy is to say whether or not the good that has happened over the past 250 years, in which we typically have elected presidents from Washington to Jefferson to Lincoln to Roosevelt, etc., who have been the right person at the right time, and the Electoral College has been the critical entity that has selected that person. Whether that benefit is outweighed by the handful of times, roughly once every 100 years, in which a person who loses the election gets the popular vote. That's a choice for you, and that's a choice for the country to make. But understand that that was a calculation, that the benefits are worth the occasional mishap. Well, let me show you the doomsday scenario that we're talking about. Let's assume there's a contentious election. Let's assume it involves war and peace. Let's assume that one party, perhaps the Democrats, are committed to go to war in the Middle East on an issue because of whatever insult has taken place. Let's assume that the other party, let's say the Republicans, are isolationists and want no part of war, and the issue is hotly contested throughout the country. In a very close election, you can take a look at the numbers yourself. The following is quite plausible and quite conceivable. It has never happened with this magnitude, but this is the doomsday scenario envisioned by those who want to change the Electoral College. The Republican candidate, the one that wants peace, the highest value of a country, wins 37 of the 50 states. 37 of the 50 states, an overwhelming majority, and receives in those states about 65 to 70% of the vote. And that's a very plausible scenario, because when candidates either on the right or the left, Democrats or Republicans, win their states, they usually win them by pretty significant majorities. So it's plausible that a peace candidate in a given circumstance could win 37 of the 50 states and receive 65% of the vote within those states and overall. The candidate who wanted war, a much more controversial position, might be appealing to certain kinds of interests in the inner cities or the large states or the cities or the defense establishment or industry or whatever. And that person, let's say, only won 13 states, but they won 13 of the biggest states. But they won those big states by a very small minority, 51 to 49, barely eked through because the issue is contentious. So you have the Republican who wanted peace winning overwhelming majorities in 37 states, the Democrat who wanted war winning tiny majorities in 13 states, and yet the way the Electoral College works, if you see the bottom, is that the Democrat who would be opting for war would win the election with 271 electoral votes, while the Republican, who had 85 million votes, double the votes, and 37 states, 3 times the states, will lose the election because he did not get the requisite number of electoral votes. This scenario has not happened. It's highly improbable, but it's certainly plausible. And that's probably would bring an end to the Electoral College as a system of government if it happened. And that's the fear that people hold out when they talk about trying to change something. It is the negative component of the reliance on the federal system and indirect democracy, but it has been viewed as much more reliable than the other fear, which was a majoritarian vote, a 51% majority, which elected an Adolf Hitler and other despots through history, are much more likely to cause dysfunction in the system than the chance, which hasn't happened in 300 years, of the scenario laid out here playing out. This is an example, graphically, of what the country would look like in that situation, where just these 13 states have significant electoral votes so that they would compromise the 207, in this case 274 electoral votes would be the result. Now, I think that it's important to go back and underscore the points here. And let's take a look at how the Electoral College, with its process, has in effect protected minorities, not just state minorities, but real minorities in real elections. Winning a majority was never the intent. It wasn't an issue, as we discussed. They focused on a system that would be seen as legitimate by both large and small states. And in doing so, it was important that the presidential candidate try to win whole states, not regions or portions of states. And that meant that to win a state like New York, you simply couldn't appeal to the population center of New York City, but you'd have to generally appeal to upstate New York and the farm districts. To win Illinois, you need Chicago and the southern part of the state. To win California, you need both north and south. And that was the intent of the Electoral College, so as to not allow an individual candidate just to appeal to a small, narrow faction, they called it, special interest, in which a temporary coalition of special interests could propel you into the presidency. You needed to win the whole state. Now, that process has produced a consensus in our politics that has primarily kept extreme parties and extreme factions from seizing control of the election apparatus. We don't have third parties that have been very viable. And within our parties, both parties, although they differ ideologically and they are getting perhaps stronger ideologically, there is a general consensus of what is considered legitimate political discourse. So Republicans don't become way right-wing and become neo-fascists. Liberals don't become way left-wing and become democratic socialists like they do in some European countries. They basically stick to a doctrine in which both sides can live with when one or the other gets elected. And that was the important part, that when the election happens, both sides have to recognize the president as legitimate. And both sides have to agree to work with the government and work with the president during his tenure, hoping to oust him and to replace him in the next election. That was the value inherent in the Electoral College, and that's the value that the framers thought federalism brings to that process. Therefore, one of the values of the Electoral College and of federalism is that it has served to be the protection of minority rights. Just for lots of examples, but let me just talk about the 1964 election, one that I'm well aware of and have for years used to point out this particular example. And just consider with me what the stakes were and see whether or not you can begin to agree that the Electoral College does have a role in moderating otherwise extreme voices. 1964, there was no civil rights laws in the country. We were coming out of the Cold War and the 1950s still, in which the people active in American government politics were largely white males. Women had the vote, but was not exercised that much. Of course, minorities could vote, but there were all kinds of restrictions from poll taxes to literacy tests that kept their vote levels low in the various states in the country. And there was not an awful strong appeal for immigrants to vote as well. So the majority of the vote, my estimate, is around 80% of the vote in presidential elections were dominated by white males. This was pre-civil rights legislation, in which the whole issue of segregation, integration in schools was just coming to the fore. And I ask you just to speculate in a national election. When we had the two candidates, we had Lyndon Johnson, who was president, who had vowed to continue John Kennedy's civil rights reform movements and had vowed to bring a civil rights legislation to the country in 1965, if elected, which would codify the rights of minorities for all time. He was opposed by Barry Goldwater, a staunch conservative, perhaps not a racist, as many have said, but clearly opposed to any kind of federal law that would grant any kind of special privilege for any group. Thought people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and ran a very conservative campaign in which he was against civil rights, was against Social Security, was against welfare, was against Medicare, was against everything having to do with government assistance to minorities. And the thought was that he had a significant play because he was talking good old red meat to the good old white male voter who typically did not want to see an awful lot of change. And people have suggested that had that vote simply been on a national basis, with no reference to states, with black voting at that time, African American voting being about 8 or 9%, 12% of the population, small minority of them were voting, 80% of the vote being white vote, women not voting. Just imagine on an issue with civil rights, Social Security, welfare being up to the election, in which the dominant vote by far was white males, what the result would have been if it was a direct national election. Don't you think it's conceivable that in a direct national election with no focus on regional issues, that 51% of those white males would have voted for Barry Goldwater and against the civil rights agenda, the minority agenda of Lyndon Johnson? But in fact, that's not the way the country worked. We had an electoral college, and once again, in that election, each candidate had to win the whole state. And it required President Johnson, if he's going to win the election, to demonstrate his commitment to civil rights in states like Michigan and Illinois and Detroit and California, where he needed both the city and the suburb. And it required for Barry Goldwater to be competitive in those states, to have something to say about his support for basic human rights, or he's not going to win the state. And that's how the process played out. In fact, as the election played out, Lyndon Johnson won a landslide because Barry Goldwater was not able to get traction in any state, even though his electoral vote, his national vote, was not that significant. Take a look at the electoral map, and you'll see how it played out. And I think you'll understand the point I'm trying to make. Now, Johnson would have probably won under any circumstances, although it's problematic, but in the Electoral College vote, where he had to win each of the states, you can see he won them overwhelming. He won all but 6 states. And he won with one of the biggest landslide victories in history. But he won 90% of the electoral votes. And that's the system designed to produce a consensus. Since he won the majority in each state cast its votes for him. He won 90% of the states. It was a landslide. But in reality, when you look at the national vote, he won only 60%. And there's significant questions that if, in fact, the election was not run on a state-by-state basis, there was just 10% that Barry Goldwater had to pick up in the course of that election to have made that a very competitive vote and perhaps turn the election around. The Electoral College that produced Lyndon Johnson was the vote that protected minorities, that allowed the civil rights legislation to be passed, that set the nation, the nation on a notion of its social welfare legislation, which recognized the rights of minorities and the extent to which those rights must be protected. In my view, that was the primary contributor to that whole period of time, which changed this country, I think most will agree, in a very positive way, was the result of the Electoral College. The Electoral College produced what the framers intended to. It produced progress, it produced consistency, it produced a reasoned election, it avoided the demographics of passion, it avoided the focus on single issues, and it allowed the country to continue to grow and to mature in a consistent way. That's an example of how federalism works way beyond the administration of government and the division of powers. And I hope you found it interesting. Thanks.